Nice to meet you. I am the clinical coordinator of the Adolescent OCD and Complex Anxiety track at Compass Health Center.
And I'm Emily Berman Crane. I am an education specialist at Compass Health Center.
So we'll start by just doing a brief overview of the objectives of our presentation this evening, just kind of talking through what we hope to accomplish by spending some time with you tonight. So our hope is that we will talk through the supporting changing mental health and educational needs of students and their families, as well as identifying the range of reactions to COVID-19 and its impact on our students and for you all as teachers. Understanding symptoms associated with depression, anxiety, and grief and loss, identifying and managing symptoms in a classroom setting, modeling self-care, boundaries, and the use of coping skills, and questions and answers. So the way that we'll structure the presentation is, as things come up, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat feature to enter in some of the questions as we go along. We will keep track of those, but we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. We will definitely leave some time to review questions with everyone as they come through. So when we think about the changing needs of students and families, especially over the past few months due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're kind of breaking this into three categories, right? We're looking at the educational needs, physical health needs, and mental health needs. So we will spend a significant amount of time talking about the mental health needs of your students that may present themselves in the classroom, both virtually and in person, but want to just kind of talk through briefly the physical health and educational needs and how those may have changed over the past few months. Educational needs, we're thinking through what's coming up, obviously, for students in the classroom setting. So perhaps we're talking about students who have struggled academically prior to COVID-19 and being able to identify the needs of those students, as well as maybe some students who are struggling academically more recently. So depending on whether your classes are in person versus virtual may also be an added element here in terms of changing educational needs for your students. When we think about physical health, obviously there may be students who have been impacted directly by COVID-19, whether that's family members who have been sick, and just in general, students who may have pre-existing conditions in terms of health or family members with health issues that may impact their ability to access their educational needs. And then mental health, obviously, we will spend more time talking through the mental health needs of students in the classroom, but knowing that, over the past few months, students who may have already struggled with symptoms of anxiety or depression, those symptoms may be exacerbated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there may be students who, prior to COVID-19, were functioning relatively well, and this has had a significant impact on their mental health needs. I don't know if there's anything, Emily, you wanted to add here just in terms of the educational changing needs.
I think I would just add that all three of these are they're very intertwined, right? So a student's mental or physical health is going to impact their educational well-being, their ability to be present academically speaking, whether virtual or in person, and those and their behavior within a classroom or within a screen, so to speak, could be directly impacted by the other two pieces. And we'll talk about that as well.
Sure. So starting, and I'm just making sure I didn't, yep, I knew I missed a slide. Skipping ahead, sorry about that. So starting with the mental health component, thinking through areas of trauma, grief, and loss. When we think about mental health, symptoms of depression and anxiety, change in supports and services, and change in structures and routines. And we will break these down into smaller pieces, but I think just starting by talking about the fact that this is an unprecedented time for all of us, that what is certain right now is uncertainty, and we know that with uncertainty comes a significant amount of anxiety for most people. That when things change and we feel like we don't have control over those things, we may experience symptoms of depression and anxiety. We may experience trauma, grief, and loss ourselves as mental health professionals or teachers or students alike, right? This can impact all of us as we manage the uncertainty. So starting with grief and loss, just touching on, you know, and I assume that most people have a general sense of grief and loss, but the psychological, behavioral, social, and physical reactions to the perception of loss. And I think just acknowledging that there can be an individual experience of loss and a collective experience of loss. So we can turn to maybe our friends and our neighbors and our community and acknowledge that we're all experiencing grief and loss during this time. So this can look like loss of routines and schedules, loss of our ability to connect with friends and family in the same way that we used to, and at the same time knowing that we all have our own individual experiences of loss. And this would be true for our students as well, right? So when we think about individual experiences of loss, we want to just think through aspects of maybe students who have experienced loss prior to COVID-19, students who may have a history of trauma, students who may have difficulty expressing their history of grief and loss, and how that can be impacted in the current climate as well. But I think finding our ability to connect with our communities in a way of saying we're in this together is certainly a helpful way of approaching some of the grief and loss that we are experiencing during this time. And so what this might look like and sound like for your students: loss of a loved one due to COVID-19, loss of connection with school, peers, family, loss of participation in a cherished activity, so sports, music, art, etc. Excuse me, loss of routines, loss of a sense of safety, and whatever that may look like or sound like for your students. This could be different for each student. Loss of in-person learning or school, loss of future activities, or just a sense of what's to come in the future, right? Again, touching into that idea of uncertainty. If we don't know what to expect, certainly feeling loss around that. Disruption to developmental trajectories and social, educational, home, and physical spheres. And loss of personal identity, self-concept, self-esteem, resilience, hope, even stable mood or stable behavior. In terms of what this might look like as educators, acknowledging that, of course, as educators, that you're also experiencing grief and loss that may be similar to your students and their families. Finding ways to support each other and colleagues through grief and loss, right? Ways to connect with our community, to talk through the experience that we're having, to provide support. Again, this idea of normalizing and allowing space to talk about your emotions, right? This idea that we are all in this together, even if we have our own unique experiences of grief and loss, that there is a common connection and thread during this time for all of us. And if appropriate, finding humor or a glimmer. And there's a star next to this just because it's important to kind of think through what we mean by a glimmer. So this isn't the idea of turning a negative situation into a positive situation. This is more, how do we approach maybe what we feel like we've lost and find a way to acknowledge maybe one particular aspect of that loss that we can find meaning in. And so for some of us, that may be through humor, but there are other ways to find a glimmer in a situation that feels out of our control or that brings up feelings of loss for us. And some of you may be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her work around grief and loss. And so this is just a helpful diagram, I think, in looking through the experience of grief and loss and identifying the different stages of shock, denial, frustration, depression, experiment, decision, integration. I think what feels most helpful about this is to know that these aren't, right, these don't go in order necessarily. We can experience grief and loss at different stages and at different times. And I think, again, this idea of how do we normalize that experience for ourselves and for our colleagues and our students, right, that we may be experiencing grief and loss that feels pretty significant one day, and the next day we may have a change in what that feels like for us, and that's all considered normal in terms of the grief and loss change curve. So I think, when we think through the grief and loss aspect, we also want to talk about the fact that as educators, right, it's not entirely like the responsibility of the educator during the classroom setting to be identifying, grief and loss during a class, right, a classroom session. That being said, these are some common stress and distress reactions that you might see in some of your students in a classroom setting or outside of a classroom, whether you're in communication with them in other aspects of their lives. But this is when additional help might be needed, when we might want to reach out or provide referrals for additional help and support. And so looking through significant changes in sleep patterns. And again, this may be information that you might not be aware of, but certainly we want to think through, are there students that are communicating to us that they aren't sleeping well, that they appear tired frequently, that they're falling asleep in class, that we've received information from a parent that they're not sleeping well. Increase in physical or somatic symptoms. So again, this may be the student that reports frequent headaches or stomach aches or nausea in the context of the classroom setting. Again, they may have health issues that could be impacting that, or it could be just specific to the experience of anxiety or depression that they may have. Increased irritability, increased distractibility. So I think this is a tricky one, and I think we can talk about this in more detail as we move forward. But in general, my assumption, and Emily, maybe you could speak to this a bit more, is that many of our students probably are experiencing an increase in distractibility, especially if the way that they are used to learning has changed drastically, right? So the students that are now expected to complete a lot of online or virtual learning, students who find that the classroom setting looks different for them than it used to, of course, then we might be seeing some increased distractibility there as well. Increase in isolation. Oh, were you going to say something, Emily?
I think that the increased distractibility is something that teachers wrestle with along with students. And I think it's worthwhile. We'll talk a little bit about strategies for maintaining a little bit, for working for addressing distractibility in general in just a minute. But to that point, I think it's worth it to say, that we can expect that from everybody in classrooms and virtually. Certainly, we all know that kids are wildly distracted while on technology. So it's, we'll have to talk about ways to reinvest kids in focusing on their classrooms and on what's going on in class in general.
Sure. Increase in isolation and avoidance. Decreased sense of safety. And my assumption is that this would come out in students reporting that, right? That their sense of safety has shifted or changed. Increase in frequency and intensity of worries. So these may be the students that ask a lot of questions that can't necessarily be answered, right? What if this? What if that? A lot of questions or concerns about the future. Avoidance of fears, right? So these may be the students who were finding it's even more difficult to get them to attend school regularly, to attend activities that maybe they previously enjoyed due to fear or anxiety associated with that. You may see students who are reporting excessive fear or anxiety around engaging in any situation due to the fear of potentially having, contracting COVID-19. Engaging in excessive reassurance seeking behaviors. So what this might sound like or look like in a classroom is the student that's asking, did I get that right, multiple times. A student who is maybe asking or making sure that they've washed their hands the appropriate amount of times for the appropriate length of time, just a lot of reassurance that they've done things correctly. Major shifts in mood or activity level. And again, we may see this in the classroom, we may not. Obviously, talk of suicide or self-harm, a report of substance use, and intrusive thoughts about COVID-19 that seem to be impairing. So when we think through ways to support students, again, we've sort of broken this down into categories of normalizing a range of emotions, establishing boundaries, validating versus fixing, consistency and predictability, tolerating distress and uncertainty, taking care of yourself as educators, and asking for help when we need it. And we'll talk through each of these in more detail. So in terms of mental health in the classroom, the first piece that we thought would be helpful to talk through is this idea of managing expectations versus reality around school. So I think for some students, there might be expectations about what school could or should look like this year. And I'm sure many of you have already seen this in real time, considering that we're a few months into the start of the school year, right? But what the expectations are that our students might have isn't necessarily in line with reality, right? Things are going to and do look different this year than they have previously. And so arguably, one of the most helpful ways of managing expectations is to be clear about what things are going to look like and to create a sense of consistency within the context of the classroom setting.
I would add on that front that setting expectations, I know that there's a little bit of difficulty with my video, and I apologize for that. We're trying to troubleshoot that. That said, I think it's important that students recognize that there are expectations relative to their education, that piece should stay normal and steady for them. The boundaries and expectations attached to school are important for kids. And they draw a lot of comfort off of those being in place consistently. The name of the game in a lot of situations with regard to this is as consistent as possible for them. So if homework on a nightly basis is standard for math, then homework on a nightly basis should happen in math. What that looks like might be more flexible or might be different, but the fact that that stays in place is actually a sense of comfort for most kids.
Yeah. And I think, leading into the next point too, this normalizing the range of reactions and creating space to talk about how the year is going. If this feels appropriate to do in your classroom, certainly can be helpful, right? Maybe creating a space and a time to check in with students each week or, once every other week around how things are going, how they feel like things are going in the classroom. Certainly, we're not encouraging teachers to open up a discussion every day around the mental health needs of their students. And is there a way to normalize, yes, this is difficult. Yes, this is frustrating. Yes, we know that things are constantly changing, and creating that space for students to talk about that, or letting them know that if there are needs that they want to talk about further, that we can point them in the direction of being able to do that. I just want to check in for a minute and see if people are able to see Emily yet. If you just want to chat.
Great.
They're saying they can see you?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
I can't see that
Thanks,
for
everyone.
some reason, but okay. So the next piece, the questions and concerns about the future and uncertainty. So, and we'll talk about uncertainty in more detail as we move forward. But I think acknowledging that there are times when we could and probably should be saying, I don't know, to certain questions, right? So an example might be, what are things going to look like in the spring? None of us really have that information, right? And so saying, I don't know, and bringing their attention and focus back to something in the present moment, right? I don't know what things are going to look like in the spring, and I know that can feel pretty scary. What's one thing that we can focus our attention on in the here and now, right? Is there some way that I can support you in this moment? Is there something that feels like it's within our control right now that we can bring our focus and attention to, especially when we know that there aren't clear answers? And I think this idea of creating space and acknowledging uncertainty, right? So yeah, we don't know what the future has in store for us this year. And that's scary, that's frustrating, that's annoying, right? Things are changing and that's out of our control. Validating that experience. And I think for many students, even just having other people acknowledge that, other students express that they're in a similar situation, can help manage those feelings as well. Acknowledging feelings of isolation and loneliness. So again, depending on how this comes up in the context of the classroom, acknowledging, going back to the previous slide, right? Are there aspects of their lives that are different now? For example, are they no longer participating in extracurricular activities that they used to find enjoyable, that used to bring them a sense of community? Are they feeling more isolated from the academic community in some way? Are they finding it hard to connect with their friends? If those are things that they're talking about in the classroom or that come up in conversation, finding a space to acknowledge and talk through that in an appropriate way in the classroom. And then this idea of holding the dialectic. And I think the next slide shows an example of what we mean by the dialectic. So I'm going to scoot over there because I think it's on the next slide. Yes. So when we talk about the dialectic, this is an example of dialectical behavioral therapy. And so this, in simple terms, is finding the balance between acceptance and change, right? So identifying what is within our control and what is outside of our control, what we need to practice some acceptance skills around, and what we can change. And we will talk about this in more detail as well in terms of distress tolerance and mindfulness, because arguably during this time, more of what we need to do is the acceptance piece, right? So a lot of what is happening is outside of our control when it comes to COVID-19 and this pandemic. And so really helping students find some acceptance, not that COVID-19 exists necessarily, but that this is what things look like for right now, and that we can't really predict what the future is going to look like, and how can we manage the distressing emotions that might come up when we don't have control.
So among the things that we wanted to help to support the education community in was classroom management and strategies relating to classroom management. I know that can be an ongoing issue for teachers across educational settings, both in person and virtually. There are lots of different ways to try to work to connect with students and also to kind of redirect conversations and behaviors. Are they fault-proof? No. But they are helpful and supportive, and they operate as a jumping off point in terms of getting things started with your students. So I know that some of your schools operate using responsive classroom. Morning meetings are a wonderful way to capture the temperature, the pulse, the mood of your class. They're also a wonderful way for you to kind of quickly model embracing the dialectic, embrace kind of talking about finding a glimmer, those kinds of pieces. We can talk about those things with kids in those settings, and that can happen both virtually and in person. Certainly in person, it happens, obviously sitting together in the classroom, distanced in whatever way feels appropriate in your school, and talking about picking a subject. Can we find something that's difficult for us and also something that's going well? Can we find a glimmer? What's a positive thing that's happened? And that could be something very small. Like, for example, my family grew a small garden this summer, and that was really cool. Or we finished an entire puzzle together. Or, my friends and I created 47 TikToks that we're really proud of. Those types of things are positives that come as a result of, this very strange situation. Breakout groups via Zoom can be really, really meaningful virtually. They can also be really, really not meaningful depending on how they're created. I would encourage, if you create breakout rooms, to have strategies and targeted points for those breakout groups to address. So I'm going to send you into a breakout room, and these are 3 things that I want you to be focused on. 1, 2, 3, and then you're going to report back to the group. Hold the kids accountable for what they're working on. The accountability, again, supports their feeling of consistency and responsibility and investment in the process. The more we can create a sense of accountability for students, the more invested they are in things. If they're passive, they're not invested, and if they're active, they are. One-on-one check-ins are always really meaningful. One of the things that we encourage and we work on with our own groups of kids is one-on-one check-ins, where we pull kids into individual breakout rooms and we talk to them individually. How's it going? What's going well? What's not going well? What would help you? Those kinds of pieces are meaningful, and it helps to foster a relationship with kids, even if you're not with them. Just the fact that you're seeing them one-on-one allows them to kind of let their guard down in a different way. One of the interesting things that we're finding in terms of virtual education is that this format allows kids who are naturally relatively anxious about sharing things, it allows them a little bit more opportunity to share because they're not physically in the same room and you're not catching their physical reaction and they're not responding to you physically in the same way. So they might be more inclined to say, I'm feeling really nervous about this, or I'm very worried about this. In the same way that they would do that texting somebody or posting on Insta, that there's a little bit of like a removed piece that allows them to share more. Certainly, if you have any ideas of ways that to connect with students or to manage classroom settings, please feel free to chat those into the group for everyone to see. It's always great to brainstorm, and certainly, more heads are much more beneficial in terms of ideas, thoughts, and collaboration. Other things that we've talked about doing are worry boxes, where you can write down something you're concerned about and put it into a box, and then it's gone for the day, right? It's something we're going to put away, but the writing it down allows it to leave your head. That's incredibly helpful too. And are there any ideas again that you have in terms of strategies that have worked within your classrooms, both virtually and in person? If you're able to chat those into the box, that would be terrific.
We'll give you like a minute or so just to kind of chat any other ideas. And I think obviously you can all read those, I think, as they're being entered in. And we will certainly leave time at the end to read back and discuss some of the ideas that are being entered into the chat feature so we can talk about that in more detail. We'll just give you a minute or so. And again, no pressure, right? Because part of what we're talking through is sort of how to establish some routines and structure and strategies. And so that may be partially what you're hoping to get out of this presentation as well.
I see that somebody posted in games. I found that a lot of teachers really do find games to be incredibly helpful. One of the games that seems to be played quite regularly, virtually speaking, is like a Find It game, where kids have to, during a 5 or 10 minute morning meeting, homeroomy kind of situation, a teacher will say something like, I need you to go find something that's blue and fits in the palm of your hand and bring it back to the screen. Or we're going to take a break for the next 15 minutes. I want everybody to go outside and bring something in to show that they found that relates to the weather, or that relates to our unit on geometry. Anything that would able to helps them to move, to connect with the class in a different way.
I'm going to move to the next slide, but certainly feel free to add into the chat feature and we can review.
Right, we're happy to review. If you can't see the chat, we'll come through and share different ideas that were shared.
As long as you can see the slides and you can see us. And we'll come back to the chat feature at the end, just to see what people are writing in. Thank you. Sorry. So the next, assuming that my slide works, hold on. Okay. So the next thing that we want to just touch on is emotions. This idea of developing and expanding our emotional vocabulary. So, one area of change and growth that the COVID-19 pandemic has created is an opportunity to talk more about our emotional states. And certainly we see that in the context of our program at Compass, but I'm sure you've also seen that at school and in your communities, right? Just more people talking through what this experience has been like for them. And whether that's students, whether it's parents, whether that's teachers, just having a dialogue about the overall impact and how we feel. So at Compass, we often use an emotion wheel, which we'll have in the next slide, to kind of help some of our children and adolescents identify specifically what emotions they might be experiencing. And I think this can be a helpful tool for students who struggle to identify their emotions, right? So you can probably think of a student where when you say, how are you doing, or how are you feeling, they say, I'm fine. Maybe the student who comes home at the end of the day, it was fine, right? This idea of how can we expand their emotional vocabulary. And the reason behind that is ultimately, if we are able to identify how we're feeling, we are more likely to have our emotional needs met. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And also this idea that if we can name it, we can tame it. And so this is something we say at Compass, and partially what we mean by that is if we can identify the emotion that we're experiencing, we can also identify what skills we can use to help manage that emotional experience, right? If we know we're feeling frustrated, if we know we're feeling annoyed, there are going to be specific skills that are going to be more helpful than if we know that we are feeling depressed and lonely. So again, this idea of expanding our vocabulary beyond just fine and okay, and knowing that our emotions help us get our needs met. I think also just finding opportunities to touch on the fact that feelings are not facts. So just because we feel it doesn't mean that it's a fact and true. It's just one data point of many. And that we often talk about feelings as house guests, right? They come, they visit us, but they don't stay forever. And again, we always want to start and lean into validating the emotional experience. So if a student reports that they're feeling overwhelmed, we want to lead with the validation piece, and we will talk about that as well. And knowing that they aren't going to feel overwhelmed forever, right? This isn't going to be a permanent state of being for them, and how to kind of help them identify ways to navigate that emotion. So here is one example, and there's a lot of emotion words on here, so don't feel too overwhelmed, but certainly looking at this and thinking, okay, if I'm feeling angry, I can move out from anger and think like, am I feeling hurt? Am I feeling mad? Am I feeling critical, right? Again, this idea of expanding our emotional vocabulary. So what might this look in the context of a classroom? I think there are opportunities, and Emily, feel free to chime in here. I think there are opportunities where students might say, I'm fine, or it's okay, where we might say, like, I wonder what else you might be feeling, or asking other students in the classroom, like, how are you feeling about this assignment? Or how are you feeling about this classroom setup? I don't think we're necessarily handing them an emotion wheel and asking them to identify their emotions at every point throughout the day. We can do that at Compass, but maybe not at school. But certainly finding a way to encourage a better understanding of their emotional experience could be helpful. I don't know if you have thoughts on this, Emily.
I do. One of the things that I really love about this emotion sensation wheel is that it works in both directions. So as a teacher, quite often when I work with especially teenagers, and I mean certainly younger kids as well, they don't necessarily say I'm angry or I'm happy or I'm sad. What might happen is I might see them doing something. Their body is actually doing something that's sending me a message. So I tend to use the phrase, I'm noticing, right? I'm noticing that your hoodie is up. I'm noticing that you're slouched over. I'm noticing that your leg is shaking more than usual. Do you want to tell me about that? Or can you share something about that? That seems to get to a better place than how are you feeling? Right? Oftentimes that's where you'll get an I'm fine or an I'm okay. But if you say, I'm noticing that you're quiet today. Is there something you'd like to share? Or is something going on? That leaves a little bit of a door open for them. That tends to help a lot. Certainly with younger kids, paying attention to what their body is doing is going to be a good key. And if you can't get anywhere in terms of those kinds of questions, that's when we reach out to social workers and to parents and administrators for added support.
I know we've talked about this as well, but I think always just creating a space where feelings are valid and important, and helping students identify ways to manage those feelings. And again, to Emily's point, if the way that we're sort of suggesting or thinking through a way to manage is to make an appropriate referral, that is also a skill, right? We are pointing them in the direction of resources available to them if they're struggling within the context of the classroom. And I think if there are opportunities, to broaden their ability to identify emotions within the classroom that feel appropriate, then that's also a direction to go as well. And again, like, if there is a way, I think, to loop it back to wanting them to help, or wanting to help them get their needs met, right? So as their teacher, as their educator, is there something that you could be doing to assist them? And if you have a better sense of how they're feeling, the likelihood of that happening is probably great.
And I think that at the same time that you can be trying to offer up possibilities how you can help, I think it's a worthwhile question, especially for kids is to say, do you have any idea of what helps you in this situation? What do you know that works well? Does taking a walk, does doing a wall sit, does getting a drink of water help? Does reading, does coloring? Is there anything that will help you to come back to where we are right now and be able to focus on our classroom setting? Oftentimes kids will say, it really helps when I do this. And, within reason and within an appropriate boundary, that might feel manageable.
And I just happened to see that I think someone asked for a copy of this wheel. And yes, the slides will be available, and we'll talk about that at the end as well. And it will include these wheels as well, and we can send those. So here's another example of identifying emotions. And you may have seen this. I feel like they have posters of some of these in classrooms and counseling offices. But again, like maybe a graphic that might be more helpful for younger students, but sort of pairing the facial expression with the emotion. But again, just bringing our general sense of awareness to our body and to our emotions.
So I want to say two things really quickly about this.
Sure.
First of all, this poster has always been really helpful to me as a teacher in two settings. One is in a regular, academic morning meeting, checking in kind of piece. And then having worked in Jewish day schools, I can speak to the idea of it working as a bilingual piece at too. I've seen it in Hebrew where it says, I'm going to, pardon me if I botch my Hebrew. It's, I think, Ech eta margish akshav, or hayom. And that tends to be a terrific opportunity for kids to not only practice their language, but really kind of hone in on how they feel in a removed way, right? So because if they can identify the emotion in a different language and it's not their home language, they're able to kind of separate themselves from the feeling so that they can work on the language piece as well. It serves as a really nice distraction. The other thing I want to say about the emotion pieces is to recognize that, oftentimes kids will say, I feel nervous, but they'll feel nervous for 30 seconds and then they're happy and then they're lonely, right? So we need to kind of think of emotions a little bit like dandelions, right? So they bloom really big and then they kind of float away and then something else comes up. So oftentimes emotions will pass, and certainly teenagers will have 13 different emotions within a 3-hour window. So we need to kind of recognize that there's a piece of this that passes for them as well, and just to kind of allow them to move through it so long as they're moving through it appropriately.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Emily. I like this graphic too, even though, I like it with all ages, I think. So moving ahead and thinking through this idea of boundaries. So as educators, right, I'm sure you're familiar just in general with this idea of boundaries in the context of the educational setting, right? So maintaining boundaries with students and families. And I think what has come up for us in previous presentations that we've done, and even just in communicating with schools throughout the course of this year and the end of last year, is that our ability to identify maybe boundaries that we previously had in place or had an easier time identifying has become a little bit more difficult over the past few months with the changing landscape of education, right? So maybe there were specific boundaries that were in place for in-person learning, and then you shifted to virtual learning, and that became a little fuzzy. I can speak for us at Compass. I know we were probably emailing a bit more than we had previously, and certainly then saying like, okay, so at what point are we taking a step away from some of the communications, whether it's email, texting, phone calls, Zoom meetings? Like, when does our workday start and when does our workday end? I think can be even more difficult at times to figure out now. And I think, speaking to this point, are there opportunities for us to set clear boundaries in whatever way, shape, or form feels like it makes sense for us in our educational community, right? So an example might be like, I'm not going to respond to emails on the weekend, or I'm not going to I don't know, text with a parent after 5 p.m., whatever it may be, being able to say like, this is a time and a space for myself. And by modeling our own ability to maintain boundaries, we are also, I think, showing our own use of skills for our students and their families as well, right? So if we have boundaries, are they able to say, oh, this might be an opportunity for me to establish some boundaries as well? And I think also just acknowledging and validating that it can feel really hard sometimes to establish boundaries, right? I'm sure for many of us, we are in these professions because we want to help and support. And it can certainly feel difficult at times, I think, to turn off, quote unquote, or to say no. Collaborating with colleagues. So again, this idea of, are there opportunities to set up times that feel helpful to collaborate with colleagues? And are there times when we want to say, again, like, we're going to turn off, we're going to shut down, we're going to unplug? Practicing self-care, and we will talk about that later on as well. So this is, I would argue, so important equally for ourselves as it is for our students. Like, I can't think of anyone that I wouldn't recommend having a self-care practice to. I just think this is a very important way for us to sort of center ourselves at the end of the day or the end of a week, to be able to say, this is something that is meaningful to me. And of course, being able to access resources for ourselves if needed, and make referrals for those that we are working with or educating if we feel like that's what is best for them as well. Just, really quick with boundaries. I'm also just want to tie it back to a previous slide in terms of consistency and predictability. I think when things feel uncertain, when things feel a little bit out of our control, being able to identify some consistency, whether that's in the context of boundaries or in general, can also be a helpful tool, right? I know that at 8 p.m. every night, this is what I'm going to do, or I know that on Saturday and Sunday, I'm disconnecting, or whatever that looks like, to be able to have some consistency there too. So some examples of self-care. So these are tools that might be helpful for students that we're working with. And again, there will be copies made available, but on the left-hand side of the screen where it says Self-Care Kids Edition, I think obviously for a younger population, and helping them identify what we mean by self-care, right? So self-care can be reading, it can be playing a game, it can be writing, it can be doing a puzzle. I would argue self-care is anything that we enjoy doing or that helps ground us. Some students, I'm thinking probably more adolescents, but who knows, might say self-care for me is watching 12 hours of Netflix. And this is a debate that we have often. I think, and again, probably as educators, you're not necessarily always going to get into this debate with them, but I think saying, listen, is there a time and a place where watching a favorite TV show can be a type of self-care? Absolutely. I think anything we're doing excessively probably isn't self-care, right? We look at that as more like, what are we avoiding? What are we, right? Like, what are we trying to manage through this, whatever it may be? So I think just bringing it back to how much time are we spending doing something, and what is the function of what we are doing? Were you going to say something there, Emily, or just nodding in agreement?
I can't nod more. I can't nod more heavily in agreement about this. So first of all, the bingo board is really lovely for, kindergarten through 12th grade. I personally think it's a wonderful activity for faculty and staff to do with one another. You can create your own bingo board and then work through those pieces together to try to brainstorm different opportunities, different ways to self-care. I would encourage, certainly for kids and adults alike, if you create a bingo board like this, to set some parameters, right? So only 2 of the pieces on your board can be technology. Right? Only 4 of the pieces can have to do with food, right? So, and the reason for those parameters is partially out of setting boundaries for kids so that they don't watch 12 hours of Netflix. And that, so that, for example, I don't sit on my couch and watch West Wing for an entire weekend, which I could easily do.
It's a great show.
Wonderful. What it does is, what we're doing is we're modeling a sense of balance for everybody, right? I can do this to take care of myself. I can also do that to take care of myself. I can go for a walk. I can bake a challah. I can play a game with my kids. I can watch a movie. All of those pieces help me to take care of myself. But one thing consistently, with no variation at all, is not really self-care.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. On the right-hand side, we have an example of a self-care wheel. And so I think this might be a more helpful tool for someone a bit older. But again, I think we can tweak this in whatever way would feel helpful. I mean, Emily, you could probably speak to what this might look like in a classroom, but I do think there are probably opportunities to bring our students' attention to their self-care, whether it's throughout the course of a school day, whether it's, one thing they're going to do that evening, something they can do on the weekend, and it can be helpful to break this into categories, right? So physical self-care, personal self-care, spiritual self-care, emotional self-care, and again, a helpful tool maybe for us to use as professionals as well, checking in around our self-care needs in all of these categories, or adding additional categories that might feel helpful as well.
And certainly on the self-care wheel, the professional piece can be replaced with educational. And you can set targets within that wheel, 3 bullet points so that every student needs to identify 3 bullet points of what they might do that would be physically taking care of themselves. And if they're not in a place to write down words or write down a phrase, pictures work. I mean, it certainly doesn't have to be a language-based thing. It can be image-based, whatever is really helpful. These are the kinds of things that I always encourage kids to either keep on a wall, in their room, in their binder, in their assignment notebook, somewhere where they can refer back to it. You look like a person who needs to do some self-care, pick a category and do one thing. Mm-hmm. It's always really helpful to give kids a really direct idea of how to take better care of themselves and the multitude of ways that they can do that.
I think too, I'll keep saying this, so forgive me, but I think bringing it back to this idea of what's within our control, self-care is always within our control. It is a skill that is always available to us. And so when our students feel like things are out of control for them, bringing it back to, this is something that we actually always have control over, right? Like we may not always have access to the self-care that we want necessarily, right? Like I may not have a puzzle, but it would be great to do one. But arguably, if we've created this wheel, we've filled it in, we've had this bingo board, there are lots of different options available to us. And I think that in general tends to decrease people's overall anxiety when they feel like I do have some control over how I can take care of myself. And again, just some more images here. So breaking it into these categories of physical, emotional, social, spiritual types of self-care. And one thing that I meant to mention in a previous slide that this just brought my attention to it, in terms of physical, we really want to be mindful of a skill that we call seeds, but this idea of sleep, eating, exercise, doctor's orders, and self-care / sobriety. So right, like when we talk about how to take care of ourselves or self-care, this can expand beyond that, right? So are we sleeping an appropriate amount most evenings? Do we have some sort of sleep schedule? Are we maybe like unplugging from devices before bed? Are we sort of restricting our maybe want for excessive napping if that's impacting our sleep at night? Are we eating 3 meals a day? Are we making sure that our meals are for the most part nutritious to us? Are we getting some form of exercise, especially as we move into the fall and the winter, right? Like this may feel harder for people to do. It's going to get darker earlier. It's going to get colder. How do we still engage in some kind of exercise? Doctor's orders, we say to the kids in program, like obviously if there's medications that are helpful to them, but this can be whatever. Are you meeting with your doctor as needed if you're not feeling well? And then the last piece being the self-care, obviously. And then the graphic on the right is just, again, all of these different examples of self-care. And I think this is really helpful to normalize that asking for help when we need it is self-care, right? It's also a skill beyond that, but saying no, and I would add here / establishing boundaries. Oh, that's there actually. But I think like creating a safe space for ourselves is self-care. At times, putting ourselves first is self-care, and being able to say that we are okay with doing that when we need to. And our students do observe that, right? And their families do observe that. And I do think that can be helpful as well. So I know we've talked about some of this too, but when we talk about validating versus fixing, I think for some of us, our knee-jerk reaction may be someone has a problem, let me go into problem-solving mode and try and fix it, as opposed to let me start with this process of validating. And so validating can look and sound different. So an example might be a student is in your classroom and they're, I think Emily talked about like how are they presenting physically? Like their hood is up, they're disengaged. Maybe they say like, this is stupid, or I don't want to do this. And so maybe validation in the context of the classroom would be, I know this is a really frustrating assignment, or I know that you must be feeling really frustrated with this, right? So leading with this place of validation. So I talk about too, like a validation sandwich, like validation, something in between validation. And the something in between is typically a skill. Although I think in the classroom, this can also be like a little bit of fixing, right? So I think it can be a little bit of, I understand that you're feeling frustrated, and maybe helping the student identify something that they can do to manage that frustration in the classroom. But as a teacher, there may be ideas that you would have in terms of how to address that frustration around that particular assignment. And then ending with the validation. You know, I'm really glad that you told me that you were feeling overwhelmed by this assignment. So I'm trying to think, maybe Emily, if there's any examples you could think of what this might look like in a classroom, as far as like the opportunity to validate, creating some space for like a skill, and then thanks for telling me.
Great. So I was thinking, so I'm going to pick up on your, this is dumb. It's one of my very favorite student phrases. This is dumb. I don't understand why we have to do this. My response to that, generally speaking, is something to the effect of, I hear that you're really frustrated right now. I got it. Message sent. You can write me a note. We can talk about it later. And also, we're going to move forward. And move forward, right? All you're doing is validating what you're doing and redirecting. You're also giving them the opportunity you're providing an outlet for them, right? The opportunity for them to share with you why they feel that something is dumb or stupid. I'm betting most of the time there's no response, right? There's maybe just because I don't feel like doing it. I hear you. We're also going to continue doing it. And then reach out to them small circle. Oftentimes it's just a moment of frustration. And if you reach out to them in small circle, the moment passes. Or they may share with you that something else is frustrating them and that it came out in the form of reading a book they don't feel like reading. My stomach hurts. I'm really hungry. I didn't sleep well. My brother yelled at me this morning. There'll be something, generally speaking, a nugget that you'll get that really is the salt of the problem and not so much the math problem or the short story.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on that so nicely, Emily, that validation doesn't mean that there aren't also expectations or consequences, right? Like this goes back to that dialectic too, right? We can be frustrated and motivated, right? We can be overwhelmed and interested, right? Two things that are seemingly opposites can exist at the same time. So we can have expectations for what needs to be completed in the classroom. We can have consequences for behavior that's not appropriate and still validate, right? We can validate that they're feeling frustrated, that they're feeling anxious, that they're feeling concerned, and this is what we're doing. And so I think that's an important piece too, because it models that we can experience all of these different emotions and still do things that we need to do in some way, shape, or form. And again, in terms of consistency and predictability, I think to the best of your ability, having clear schedules and routines when possible. So, I think students prior to March of 2020 sort of always expected and predicted what school would look like to some degree, right? We would attend school daily. These are the months that we attend school. This is when we don't have school. This is the time of school. And I think that's, for the most part, been pretty consistent and predictable. And COVID-19 certainly threw all of that out the window. And there was a general sense of who knows what's to come. So I do think that opportunities that we have to create schedules and routines are helpful, not just in the classroom, just for all of us in life at this point, right? Like knowing what to expect in the areas where we have control is a helpful tool available to us. And so this can look a certain way in your classroom, as well as maybe expectations or schedules around homework, general school expectations. So again, I'm sure that there are certain expectations in terms of what things look like at school since COVID-19. But even prior to COVID-19, right, we would have conversations of like, if there's a school rule that you can't have a phone, then you can't have a phone, right? There isn't really wiggle room around that. And so as much as students tend to push back on those rules and expectations, they actually are a way to help manage anxiety and distress, because there is predictability. A clear understanding of expectations, rewards, and consequences, again, maybe within the context of your classroom, as well as the school community at large, or, if you're in communication with parents that are feeling overwhelmed, this is also a helpful tool available to parents, right? What are the clear expectations that they have at home? And truly, again, going back to holding the dialectic, consistency and flexibility, right? So yes, we are going to have a consistent plan for class every day, and we need to be flexible if something changes that we didn't anticipate. And by the way, this is true in life in general, arguably probably more true now than ever before, but we are going to be consistent and predictable to the best of our ability. And when things happen that we didn't predict, that are outside of our control, we are going to have to create some flexibility. And again, predictability and uncertainty. So to the best of our ability, the things that are within our control or that we can predict, we're going to do our best to do that. And there are some things that we cannot predict no matter how much we try. Were you going to add something to that, Emily?
Truthfully, I was just going to come back to the schedules and routines in classrooms. I would certainly encourage, to the degree that you're capable and able to create a sense of consistency within classroom settings, virtual or in person, it's to your everlasting benefit to do so, right? So I don't know what's going to happen in March, but I do know that every Thursday there's a spelling test, right? That's something to rely on, right? I'm not sure what winter break is going to look like. And also we're editing essays today, right? Those kinds of pieces allow kids to recognize that there are things that they can rely upon that are, generally speaking, within reason, unchanging. An example in my own home would be, I'm not really sure what Thanksgiving looks like, but all of our bed sheets get changed on Thursdays. Right? That's without fail. That's something that happens, and kids rely on the consistency. And that I describe boundaries as kind of like riverbeds, right? I'm not sure where the river is headed, but I can tell you the boundaries of it. I can tell you where the beds are. And so long as I can keep you within the beds, we're all headed in the same direction. And that really is the ultimate goal in terms of a classroom. So if we don't get to unit 12 in our spelling book or unit 15 in our math book, that's okay. We're all headed in the same direction. And the tests and the assignments attached to it may look different than they would have looked a year ago now, but we're still doing them, and we're still holding ourselves accountable for the work that we do and the way that we behave.
I love that example. So, of course, uncertainty, which is, like we've talked about, such a main component of what we are all experiencing, right? So practicing acceptance around not knowing, which is arguably much harder said than done. How do we accept what we can't know? And so this is also sort of combining a skill that we review at Compass called radical acceptance, right? So acknowledging that there are certain things that are outside of our control that we need to accept, and sort of creating space to let go, right? Letting go of what we can't control or change. And acceptance, acknowledging that acceptance doesn't mean we like it. Acceptance doesn't mean we're glad that we're in this position. Acceptance doesn't mean that it's fair. Acceptance means there's actually not much that I can do about this particular thing. And so acceptance around not knowing for our students, to Emily's point, might be like, we don't know what things are going to look like in the spring. We don't know what graduation might look like. We don't know what the next school year will look like. And practicing some tolerance around that. And going back to, I think, what we had spoken about earlier, like, are there opportunities to say, I don't know? Acknowledging that uncertainty is a part of daily life, and of course, intensified now. Recognizing what we can and cannot control. So again, bringing our students' attention back to like the present moment and what we can be doing in the here and now. We can't predict what will happen, and we can cope ahead, right? So some students may say like, well, what if this? What if this? What if this? What if this? Right? And then it just sort of spirals from there. I think it's appropriate to have a cope ahead plan. So again, what this might look like in the classroom is, to Emily's point, like every Thursday we have this test. And if a student were to say, well, like, what if school was closed, right? So a suggestion around like how might they cope with that, and provide some direction in terms of that, as opposed to just like continuing to go down the what if cycle. And just acknowledging that if we are more able to tolerate uncertainty, right, to acknowledge that there are certain things outside of our control and we accept that instead of constantly trying to find information that's not available to us, or seeking a ton of reassurance, or asking a lot of questions that can't be answered, arguably we will have more time for happiness or fulfillment or joy or just a sense of calmness potentially. We'll have more energy to put towards activities that are valued to us. We'll be more likely to use skills. We'll feel more connected. We'll be able to set goals more appropriately, and we might be able to engage in more activities. And so just a graphic here of like the difference between being in our thoughts, right? Like being wrapped up in our thoughts and fighting against the current, as opposed to just observing some of those thoughts, right? Can we acknowledge that some of those thoughts are here and still engage in our life in a meaningful way, right? So especially with anxiety, there's just certain things we can't know, and we can still practice self-care, and we can still call our friend, and we can still eat dinner with our family. So briefly, I just want to review this. We did have a video, but I'm thinking we'll pass the video just to save more time for questions and answers. But this is a skill that we've been using at Compass and reviewing in some of our other presentations as well. It's an acronym. It's FACE COVID. And, you know, I think just some of this is what we've reviewed so far, but the F stands for focusing on what's within our control. A is acknowledging your thoughts and feelings. C is coming back into your body. So whether this is through some mindfulness, some self-care, engage in what you are doing, right? So trying to be in the present moment as much as possible instead of the future or the past. Committed action is a fancy way of saying our values, right? So how do we engage in our values? How do we commit to actions to engage in our values? Opening up to different experiences, identifying what our core values are so that we can engage in activities that are meaningful to us, identifying resources that are available, and of course, disinfect and distance. Just, you know, practice safe hygiene. Okay, now the slides are being silly, so give me 1 minute. Okay. So distress tolerance is a category under the dialectical behavioral therapy that we spoke about earlier, and around the acceptance piece. So when we talk about distress tolerance, we're talking about how to manage our distress more effectively. We want to encourage our students and ourselves, arguably, to avoid the use of unhealthy coping skills when we're feeling distressed, right? So we talked about earlier, like, could we watch 14 hours of The West Wing? Sure. Are we avoiding? Are we using an unhealthy coping skill? Are we feeling so overwhelmed that that's our way of managing? Just bringing our attention to the why behind some of those avoidance activities that we may be using. Acknowledging and validating that pain is unavoidable at times, right? So again, this goes back to the grief and loss piece, that yes, we are all in this together. Yes, we are experiencing grief and loss, and pain is unavoidable. And the acceptance and tolerance around what we can't control. So we can't control COVID-19. Well, we can't control it's here. We can control, like, you know, wearing our masks and washing our hands and things like that. But we can't control that it's here. We can't control whether school is in person or virtual. We can't control the rules that are put in place by school or at home or our community due to COVID-19. And these are examples of some general distress tolerance skills. And I think what's helpful about distress tolerance skills is truly they can be used anywhere. And as long as students are aware of them, or we can prompt them to use some, they're pretty easily accessible. So we want to make sure that it says here easily accessible skills are available to us. We can plan ahead in terms of maybe some distractions, right? So if I'm in class and I know that I get really, really overwhelmed, can I plan ahead to use an ABC mindfulness skill? So this is something that we talk about at Compass. We think of a category. For me right now, it would be desserts. And then I would think of a dessert that starts with each letter of the alphabet, right? So if a student is feeling overwhelmed in class, can they take a break and on a piece of paper with their pen, try and engage in some ABC mindfulness for 2 or 3 minutes and then return to the lesson? We also sometimes encourage students to create a list that they can keep on their phone, on an index card, in their binder, somewhere easily accessible that if they are feeling overwhelmed, they can quickly refer to it. Self-soothing and self-care, which we've talked about, are distress tolerance skills. Pros and cons are also distress tolerance skills, right? Like, what is the pro of me doing this homework assignment that I really don't want to do? And what is the con of me saying, no, I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to play video games instead? And radical acceptance, which we already talked about as well. So again, another graphic here, just in terms of our stress survival guide, focusing on like body, mind, and soul, different distress tolerance skills. I love that it says take a little nap. You know, I only work with adolescents. So of course, for those of you that have an adolescent or work with them, I'm sure you're familiar with like, I'm just going to take like a 3-hour nap, right? And so part of the conversation there is like, can we take a 30 to 45-minute nap and then like re-engage with some sort of activity that is valuable or meaningful to us?
I want to really quickly speak to the taking a hiatus from social media. I think that for kids, certainly adults as well, but for kids in general, that's a very challenging thing to do. They are really quite inundated in their own lives, and it is a way for them to connect with friends and other people. So it's incredibly challenging to ask kids to take a break from social media. As teachers, I think we're in a unique position, and we're able to model that and set structures and actual challenges for kids relative to taking those breaks. So we could actually say to our students, tomorrow, I want everybody to take an hour, and I want you to put your phone in the kitchen, and I want you to go do something that has nothing to do with technology, and then you're going to report back to me about it, or you're going to draw a picture of it and share it on your Zoom screen tomorrow. Right? And encouraging those kinds of behaviors will not only allow for those breaks in social media, but they'll also kind of challenge a different form of creativity for kids. And allow them to engage in, you know, the world outside of technology, which is it is really hard for them these days, and certainly this situation is only exacerbating that.
Here's another graphic of just 50 ways to take a break. Now again, maybe this wouldn't be the tool to use in the classroom, right? We're not like, hey, take a step out, go for a walk, call a friend, but just maybe for ourselves, right? As the adults, different ways that we can take a break or practice some self-care. And I know that we talked about radical acceptance briefly, but I do just like this graphic of like what I can control and what I can't control. Again, like creating space for, we don't have to like what is happening, but we do have to accept the reality of what is happening. And the more that we sort of push back against the reality, we say like pain and then non-acceptance of reality is actually what creates suffering, right? So the more that we push back against the reality of how things are, the more that we dig our heels into something, the more we suffer, right? And so this idea of radical acceptance is, of course, I can feel frustrated and sad and annoyed and lonely. And there are still skills within my control. There are still aspects of my life that are within my control that I can bring my attention to. And of course, as always, the validation piece for ourselves, right? Validating our own experience.
And for younger kids, a different way to phrase this, what I can't control and what I can control piece is, if you're paring it down to its youngest, it's what am I the boss of? And what am I not the boss of? Right? Kids are able to parse out quite easily. This is what I'm the boss of, and this is what I'm not. And that will work quite well with this wheel as well.
I like that for us as adults too. I'm going to start saying that. And so acceptance is, right, like on the left, we have it's raining. I don't like it. I wish it wasn't raining. My day would be better. Actually, now that I think about it, I might have had some of these thoughts today when it was raining. If it wasn't raining, my day is ruined. Every day is like this. It's always like this. Why does it always rain? And on the right-hand side, we have it's raining. Yep, right? We can't change it. We don't have to like it. And the rain is here. Some additional distress tolerance skills, we call these grounding techniques. again, really easily accessible to students in the classroom. We use these skills when we are in the process of radically accepting something. So these could be taking a break if appropriate and necessary from the classroom. Again, you probably don't have a pet in your classroom, but if students are at home, pet your pet. Doing some sort of guided breathing. So this could be 4x4, we have triangle, we have color breathing. We really just encourage students to identify a breathing technique that they find most helpful for them. And we have a slide about that in the next one. TIP stands for temperature change, intense exercise, and progressive muscle relaxation. In the classroom, this could look like a student who's tensing their muscles and then releasing them. It could look like a student who takes a break to splash some cold water on his or her face, or to get some ice that they can hold in their hand. Using our 5 senses. So they're in the classroom, they're feeling distressed. Can they identify 5 things that they can see and write them down? 4 things they can feel, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, 1 thing they can taste. We'll also talk to students about having a little coping bag, something that they can keep on their person or in their backpack that might include like a mint or a Jolly Rancher or something that can help with the taste portion of 5 senses. And then for some students, using fidgets. And again, different ways to have students identify maybe some coping tools that could be helpful for them. Just different images to use for that as well. And here are some examples of the breathing exercises. So 4x4 is one of the most common ones we talk about at Compass, and this is the graphic on the left. We inhale for 4, we hold for 4, we exhale for 4, we rest for 4. And then on the right-hand side, we have all of these different examples, maybe for younger students, although arguably truly anyone can benefit from bringing our attention to our breath. But I just like that there's different graphics and different ways of explaining, and bumblebee breathing and back-to-back breathing, just different ways to engage students in breathing exercises when appropriate. And this is also just a quick video. And again, we will send this for those that would want it. But this is an example of, again, for younger kids probably, but a quick 4x4 breathing meditation that involves fish in the ocean is very cute. But if you were to go to YouTube, there's tons of resources available there in terms of helping with bringing our attention to our breath. And for those of you who, again, this is another video, we'll pass this, but you'll have access to this. For those of you who aren't familiar with this book, Alpha Breath, it's a great book for mindful breathing, written for kids. Although, again, arguably, I can't think of anyone who wouldn't benefit from some alpha breath.
Right. Really, very quickly, I would certainly encourage having. When I did teach in public and in Jewish day schools, I taught middle school. So I would encourage. I can't say enough good things about reading children's books to middle schoolers or children's books to high schoolers. They really draw so much more out of it. The children's books, by and large, aren't written just for children. Because the adults around them are the ones who generally read them. So again, I would always reflect back on what a high schooler or what a middle schooler could draw from these types of books as well, or videos as well.
I also think I apologize because I'm not sure how many of you are doing in person versus virtual teaching at this point, but I do think just in terms of creativity virtually, knowing that there are so many videos available, whether it's on YouTube or just specific websites to engage students in the process of bringing their attention to their breath is such a helpful tool. Whoop. And then this is as we move into the new school year, but we are in the new school year. So one thing that we just like to talk about is gratitude, right? Bringing our awareness and our attention to gratitude. And again, this doesn't need to mean like we're so thrilled that we're in this experience that's so difficult for so many of us. And what is one thing we are grateful for this school year? What is one thing we are grateful for this week? And if there's an opportunity as a class potentially to identify like one thing we're grateful for as a class or as a community, I do think that this can be a helpful tool for students to identify like gratitude What's one thing? Again, typically this may be something that we do have some control over, but what's one thing that we're feeling grateful for? And so if you want to use the chat feature, feel free, and certainly don't have to. But I think the question and what we were just thinking through is, what have you been grateful for, or is there a way that you could use this in the context of your classroom?
And certainly you could model this concept with your own classes. You can chat, feel free to have students chat in something that they feel grateful for. I also, in terms of the cross-curricular cross-curriculum in terms of Judaic studies and general studies, it's a great opportunity to use Judaic studies as an opportunity, as a jumping off point for gratitude. Certainly, the tenets of Jewish thought and Jewish teaching lean really heavily on recognizing, the goodness, the inherent goodness and value in even the most difficult situations. It's a good opportunity to blend curricula and connect with kids' real life experiences.
And again, just another image in terms of what we're grateful for. If this was part of a conversation that you would be having, whether it's with students within your community, as adults, as teachers, with friends, just different examples of things that might be coming up for us in terms of gratefulness. And then just leaning into this idea of goals and motivation, and I'll move through this pretty quickly so that we will have time for questions at the end. Of course, motivation can be impacted when things change and when things feel outside of our control. I think what we're hearing from a lot of students this year on our end is they're really having a hard time identifying clear goals for themselves and feeling motivated in terms of the academic process. And so I think going back to this idea of establishing clear expectations, both at school and at home, is a huge piece of this. And then I think the next slide talks through taking small steps, right? So breaking things into small steps, whether that's like I have to study for a test for 2 hours. That feels really overwhelming. I'm not really feeling super motivated to do that. I'm pretty distracted at home because I have all of these other things that I could do, like watch 12 hours of West Wing, Emily. And so how do I break this into really small steps? Is it possible that I can study for 30 minutes and then take a 15-minute break? Is it possible, while it's still nice out, that I could sit outside at wherever in a park and study for 30 minutes, right? A change of scenery. Breaking things into small steps can certainly help them feel more manageable. And I'm sure you as teachers can help students identify opportunities to do that as well. And briefly, one of the skills that we review at Compass is a skill called motivation equation. And so helping students identify SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound. Helping them identify energy. So for them, that can be food or exercise, sleep, self-care, and choice, right? Acknowledging that we do have a choice in what we are willing to do versus maybe what we are feeling we are unwilling to do. And all of those three things combined can help us with our motivation. So we have here just some continuing thoughts in terms of the school year and questions. What kinds of thoughts and feelings am I having about the school year? How can I make space for these? What is in my control? What skills can I use to take action? What is out of my control? What skills can I use to accept? And who can support me? What resources do I have? And how do I refer out for students who need additional support? And lastly, these are just some resources that are available. And we want to thank you all so much for spending your evening with us. We truly appreciate you all being here. And like I said, want to just give you some space and time. If there are any questions, we will go back to the chat feature now and read through. But feel free to enter in any additional thoughts or questions you might have, and we will answer them. At first, I'm just seeing, can everyone hear us? Okay, so I'm going to read through some of the questions that were here.
So one of the comments that was made was questions about connecting with kids when you have to keep a distance. I will say, I hear you. That's hard. I experience that on a daily basis as well. It's incredibly challenging. That said, I think the kids are very. Understand. I hear you. That's
Emily's Siri.
My phone is letting me know that it's next to me. Thank you, phone. It's incredibly challenging. And also, students understand that. So, guys, I need you to take a step back. Let's figure out a way to connect with one another differently. Do you have any ideas of how we can do this? Certainly, I would engage students in brainstorming for how to connect with one another. If that's through, charades at a distance, if that's through drawing a picture, if that's through um, different types of, alphabet games and different ways to connect that don't require people to be close together. I know it. I can't validate anybody. I can't validate you enough in terms of how challenging it is to want to connect with kids and not be able to actually connect with kids. It's very, very hard, but it does require us to be very creative and kind of look at things more prismatically than we have in the past.
And just to chime in there, and of course, I'm a social worker, not an educator, but I do think even when it feels difficult for us to, engage with our students or our friends or members in our community or whoever with, masks on and 6 feet of distance, I will say that so many of the adolescents that we are working with are still finding it so beneficial and helpful to be in person. There is just something about being in the same room with someone, maintaining eye contact. I think it is a sense of normalcy, even though things look different. So I think as difficult as it may be, and it does feel difficult, it does feel different, that there is still a benefit in just you being a presence. Any other thoughts or questions?
I'm seeing nothing, which is great.
So we answered every question.
Amazing.
Look at that. So again, we thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It was really great to spend an hour and a half with you all and presenting these slides, and hopefully there's something that will be of help to you. And like I think I had posted in here and mentioned at the start, we will make these slides available. I also think, hold on. What about anxiety with wearing masks? I'm assuming that this question is specific to like students who are feeling anxious about wearing masks. If you want to expand on that, feel free. But I think in terms of like, if this question means, what about students about concerns with peers? Not. Oh, okay. So I think that's interesting. So I think that's clearly valid, right? I think that there are definitely some students currently that are concerned about peers not following the rules. And I think as the adults, really sort of acknowledging and reinforcing that that there are protocol in place, and like that there is a response that will happen when rules are not followed. And again, that may be different from school to school or setting to setting, but I think acknowledging and validating the fear and anxiety that comes up around that. And I do think that is an opportunity to provide some reassurance appropriately around what would happen if students were not following the policy and procedure that was in place at school, right? The same way, like if there's a policy and procedure around phone use, like then there is a policy and procedure around phone use.
I would add, if the concern is around peers not following protocols outside of school, so if we're dealing with like kids don't wear masks when they should outside of the building, that might be a great opportunity to have a conversation about what I'm in control of and what I'm not in control of, right? I can't necessarily control what everybody around me is doing, but I can control what I do, and I can control my reaction to it, right? So if I'm not comfortable with the fact that, that group of kids, that are, across the street or hanging out or walking around, are not wearing masks, I'm well within my right to put on my mask and not be with them, right? That's okay. I can also say to them, can you please wear a mask? It makes me more comfortable. There are things that I'm capable of doing that allow me to feel a little bit more in control of the situation, but certainly we have to recognize that we can't control what everybody else around is doing all the time.
A great question. Thank you. And just what I was going to mention before, the slides will be available. I believe that the presentation is posted on the website and we can make the slides available. And I was going to say a really great resource in terms of finding some of those graphics is Pinterest. And the videos are on YouTube. So even if you were to go to YouTube and type in 4x4 breathing or breathing exercises for kids, there's tons of resources, as well as the emotion wheel, all available via the World Wide Web. So you'll have the slides, and also just wanted to let you know that as well. So we thank you so much, and we look forward to collaborating in the future, and wish you the best of luck this year.
Take good care.